This is course 2 of the Watson with Python on Bluemix series. In course 1 you learnt about the basics of using Python in the Bluemix environment. In course 2 you're going to learn the basics of consuming Watson services in Python. We're going to be covering language identification in this first part. The whole series covers language capabilities. Language capabilities because they are the easier of the services to use. They just need text input and you'll get JSON output. So if we go into the dashboard and we go into catalog, we can filter the services that are available on Bluemix, and we'll filter them by Watson, and here we can see all the Watson services that are available. I'm going to be picking language translation. In this series we're going to be developing an application whereby we begin to understand what the user is trying to communicate, or how the user is trying to communicate. The first part will be to understand the language. Here you see some details about the service. We're going to leave the application unbound, and we're going to select the trainable plan, which will allow us to create our own translation models, which we won't cover but in this series, but maybe next time. So we instantiate the service, and the service credentials option on the left hand side gives us the basic information that we need to be able to use this service. So there's the entry point, which is the URL, and then the credentials, user ID and password, and I've deliberately obscured them because I don't want to compromise these services, because whenever I use those services, Watson knows who is these credentials have been given to, and hence who to charge for consuming the services. If I go into GitHub, into Watson Developer Cloud, and look for the Python SDK, the Python SDK is what we're going to be using. The SDKs within Watson Developer Cloud provide wrappers around the REST APIs. All the Watson Developer Cloud services are available as REST APIs, and you can consume those directly, but the wrappers, the SDKs, make them easier to consume. So in examples, there is an example of how to use each service. So we pick language translation. Language translation has language identification as well as translation capabilities, and here you see how to import the service, how to instantiate the service, and how to invoke methods on the service. More detailed documentation can be found in the Watson Developer Cloud homepage. If we find the language translation service, come to its homepage, and there's a documentation button from which we see an API reference, and here we can see samples in Curl, Node, Java and Python for this service. So if we have a look at identify language, we'll see how to invoke the service, what we need to pass in, just simple text, and the response that we're going to get back. It's going to be an array of languages with a confidence language and a language. We'll be picking the 0th version, the first one. So let's start looking at our source code. We're going to start off with Flask because it's a simpler framework. All the code, and this is the first time we're going to be looking at code, is in one place, watson.py. There are some hard-coded strings in here which we'll need to protect because we have a secret key. That secret key is used to sign forms that come in, so that does need to be kept secret. So if you do put this file into a repository like Git, then you're going to have to move this key into a separate credentials file, something we'll cover in course 3. Near the top we bring in the SDK and pull in language translation from the SDK as per the documentation. We define one route, which is WL-lang. We deliberately don't define a route into the root. You can if you wish. we instantiate a form, and the form only has one field, or two fields, a text area field and a submit button. We then instantiate the service, the language translation service, passing in credentials, and here I'm going to tap in the username, password, credentials that I've got from Bluemix. So we're hard coding the values in here, and again in course 3 I'm going to show you how to protect those so you don't have to share them in a source code repository like Git. So we pull out the 0th element, which is the first element, first language, the confidence level, construct a string that we're just going to send to the template. It's fairly simple. Let's look at the Django version. The code is essentially the same, just spread out. So for example, the application key is actually in the settings file, but the entry is going to be URLs py. Now, following best practices, the application URLs or the application routes are in a separate file. This allows us to reuse application modules in different projects. So let's find the application URLs file, which is in Watson language URLs. And here we're defining the one route, lang, which will be off the WL route that's defined in the higher level URLs file in the project level. So our route is WL lang, the same as Flask. We pull in a view, and the view is WL. And here we see the SDK from which we're pulling in language translation. We have a form that looks very similar to a Flask form, which we instantiate, and we instantiate the language translation services in an identical manner to how we did it in Flask. And at the bottom we return and render the template. So let's take a look at the template, which has mainly HTML with some injections where we can see the form and a couple of strings telling us whether a language has been detected or whether an error has been detected. We can see the CSRF token, which helps secure the communications. So have a look at the Flask version. The HTML is fairly similar. The way we pull in the form is a little bit different. That's really about the only difference between the two. No. So now let's run the application locally. We'll do the Flask application. Now that we've wired in language identification, we shouldn't be seeing the errors we were seeing before, the credential errors. Make sure we're on the right page. 5000 for Flask. And it's detected with a reasonable high level of confidence that the language was English. Let's try it with some German, the Flask version. I need to colour code these. There we go. So we're now very confident the language was German. We're now ready to push the application, but before we push the application, let's just make sure that the application that we've got is failing as it was before. We need to enter some text. So there we are. The application is running and we're getting access errors due to invalid credentials, which we were expecting. So now we're ready to push this application, or push the changes to the application. It's going to take a bit longer because it has to destroy what it's already got and then rebuild. And the rebuild again is building the Cloud Foundry stack. It builds the Python build pack. It builds in the Python runtime. It brings in the application prerequisites and then the application itself. This is going to take a little bit longer to restart. Application has restarted, so we'll try it out with some English text. and then some German. And it's now detecting language for us. So now you know how to find documentation about Watson services and how to integrate a Watson service into your application.